Welcome everyone to the first meeting this year of the AI and the Humanities University Seminar Series. We're delighted today to have this discussion of two really stimulating, intriguing pieces by eminent literary scholar and Katherine Hayles, who is a distinguished research professor at UCLA and a professor emerita at Duke and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In a moment, I'm going to hand things over to Professor Alice Joubin from the English department, director of the Digital Humanities Institute. But before I do that, she's going to be leading our discussion today. Before I do that, I wanted to mention a few of our upcoming events. First of all, in October, Professor Hayles will be actually coming here personally to the university and organized by Alexa and the English department and co-sponsored by this seminar. And she'll be coming, you'll be getting plenty of notices about this, but she'll be giving two presentations, one on October 22nd on how should we use LLMs with literary and cultural texts. And then the next day, as part of this seminar series, she'll be giving a talk on modes of cognition, implications for AIs. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alexa, who will lead us in this discussion of Dr. Hayles' work.
Thank you, Katrin, for having me. And good morning, everyone. Really good to see you all. Today, it's a bit of a reading group, but if you haven't read it, no worries. I'm summarizing the pieces anyway. So this is in preparation for Katherine Hayles' visit to GW, our major event this semester. And the coherent piece here between the two articles really is the idea of metaphor. And she talks a lot about how metaphors matter in terms of how they organize our thoughts. They are not just the vehicles. People tend to think of this like kind of figure of thoughts, or just a vehicle. The kind of metaphors we choose predetermine the kind of thought we can have. So it's kind of channeling, directing our thoughts. And of course, she started by quoting the classic Lakoff's linguistic study called Metaphors We Live By. Basically, the contention here is that when GPT first came out, there's a lot of anthropomorphizing metaphors about AI, using verbs like hallucination or falling in love. And that may be fine, but actually the side effect is it can obscure human agency so that it's this thing that is not human, and we just forget about all the labor that goes into it, or that it's highly collaborative. It also mythologizes AI kind of redirecting responsibilities so that the tech bros are invisible. They're not responsible. The designers are not responsible. It's just, you know, a human-like being that hallucinates. And so that's the problem with metaphors. And in the feminist piece, the book is called Feminist AI, which I find really interesting. It's brand new, just out. She proposes maybe a better metaphor is technosymbiosis. So it's partly based in biology, talking about long-term relationship between two or more organisms that live in physical proximity, not temporarily, but typically in natural world, you see symbiosis is kind of lifelong relationship. Techno-symbiosis would emphasize our relationships with all kinds of agents, so they can be human, non-human, like animals and plants, but also computational media like AI. And all of this is just in our environment. And if you use this kind of metaphor, you can locate human being in relation to other species and environment. So it's all about relations. And I find that pretty useful, since yes, AI is already now a permanent ambient noise. There's no pretending, even those who strongly object to it or kind of take a different approach, it's an attitude, it's a reaction toward this particular agent. So how do we think about it? And so I'll go over them one by one. The first one is called technosymbiosis. It's about our relation to AI in the feminist AI book. The second one is a preview. She has a new book coming next year. It's called Bacteria to AI. Again, it's kind of building on this idea of symbiosis, of a ecological kind of environmental view. So that's part one. So some of the highlights, just critiquing anthropocentrism. Basically, the traditional view of humans as rational, autonomous entities, largely the Western view. Humans as something autonomous, kind of separable from the environment. Humans are not animals. We're different from animals. We're better than animals, right? It's rational beings. And she says that type of anthropocentrism, kind of human first and human centered thinking, which also has been criticized in ecological studies. And then the second one is this idea called cognitive assemblage. Interactions among all cognitive entities can create new forms of meanings. And at some point, she's talking about, for example, by bacteria or cells, they create plenty of meanings, perhaps not accessible to non-social. Perhaps we think so the argument saying that cognition that I think is not controversial at all. Of course, we are part of by other agents. And so I'm basically going by this order: summary, and then offering my summary. Actions are not done in a vacuum. Queer theory is just the poor. Also uses the percentage. Our identity is not it's not entirely self-determined, and it's not entirely made. Again, we move through the world with have various elements that may or may not become part of the ultimate. That came to me about language is that it's different from assembly. Assembly, like assembly line. Assembly is really talking about assembly would be like build a model airplane. Of course, the airplane has pre-designated shape and structure. So all the pieces, plastic pieces, like Lego pieces, each one has a designated destination. They have a kind of a fate, and they all go in. But assemblage for human identities, or the kind that Hayles is talking about, is very different from building a model airplane. We actually don't know ahead of time what the final shape would be. So it's not assembly. And reading all that, I came up with this myself. I thought maybe another interesting metaphor could be ecology of words. Kind of, if we think about ecology, and in this kind of environment, we would think about the effect of words, the action that is trying to induce, rather than necessarily only where it came from. Current obsession with this is that, especially for anyone who teach, kind of where the words came from is really important. Because of AI being in the midst. But if you turn our attention to ecology, not to say that plagiarism is not an issue, we don't talk about it, but just to pay attention also to other surrounding issues. As for technosymbiosis, my take is that we should indeed be thinking about metaphors, thinking through metaphors, and thinking with metaphors, always about the interdependent relations between humans and other agents. Maybe that has been sidestepped for too long. We haven't. She said it's a feminist issue when you start thinking like this. It's potentially emancipatory, so that you are not so obsessed about humans coming first and foremost. It's a socially constructed approach, basically, to technologies. And we talk about cooperation and collaboration a lot, or what is known as civic science. Currently, resources are controlled by a few corporations, but if we talk about civic science, we talk about scientists being responsible citizens and regular citizens who are not experts also actively have a say about technologies being created that will affect everyone else. Speaking of human AI collaboration, I thought that argument has implication for able-bodiedness and disability support. Basically, she's saying that alternative modes of relating to the world or understanding the world is as valid and important. Think of AI and other technologies as augmentation or prosthesis. And maybe the fear is misdirected. People fear AI's domination. But maybe we should worry about the ingrained able-bodiedness in design principles. For example, we talk about in this group how AI standardizes certain kind of English, all of those issues, rather than simply domination. And another thought that came to me reading all this is the idea of counter-archive. If you think of humans, animals, plants, technologies, all in an ecological setting, then we're beginning to talk about many possible ways of preserving legacy and archiving. So the idea of counter-archive is basically a theory that we need more than one archive, more than one way to chart our collective memory. And archiving is not just adding more artifacts to archives. For example, GPT is an archive. It's just, the data set to train it grows ever larger and larger, just add more. That's not it. We should actually pay attention to the logic of archives. So we should interrogate that. So that's a kind of core part of the theory of counter-archive. We can build more inclusive narratives around it. And I thought writing is actually, people don't think of writing as archive, but it is, right? Writing can be a type of counter-archive or a form of cultural preservation as well. So this takes me to preservation theory. Jorge Otero Pelo has a theory called experimental preservation, meaning that to preserve something is not to take it, shrink wrap it, put in a museum and on display. He uses the adaptive reuse of architecture as an example. Typically, a building has served a certain function before it becomes a hotel today or something like that. And that's not to say it'll erase its traces or heritage. It's a type of preservation. So it's preservation is an active mode. It's an active mode. And if we think of it this way, maybe GPT can be thought of as engaging in some kind of preservation mode through mimicry. It's a mimicry machine, right? So to mimic, to preserve some form of human writing and legacy. And so words from the past, like history, they're not fixed, but rather they're activated in contemporary interpretations or rewriting, writing and rewriting and writing over it. So I just wanted to point out the red bit, and then I'm going to skip to the slide after. She talks so much about metaphors, and I thought we discussed in this group about the importance of writing and language, what language really is. Language is not just a vehicle or a tool, but rather language already possesses agency in and by itself before anyone comes in and use it. In the sense of, at one point, this article talked about this idea called gift wrap. The gift wrap idea, which she critiques as too simplistic view of communication. She says, the gift wrap idea is, you imagine I have an idea, I'm going to gift wrap it, hand it to you, you unwrap it, you open it, and you receive it. It doesn't, like, ideas wrapped in language and delivered to the receiver. But the problem is language is not merely a container for preformed thought. It actually influences how we think, right? The wrapping you chose already is influencing, and then this interpretation question when on the end of the receiver. So the gift wrap idea does not reflect the reality of communication. That's another idea that came out in this particular one. So part 2. And I can return in greater detail to any of these. I just wanted to cover that all this in about 30 minutes so that we have time for discussion. In Bacteria to AI, similar ideas, but some new terms. The first one is integrated cognitive framework. In this framework, again, she values non-human forms of cognition, and she calls it meanings. Non-human agents can generate meanings, like bacteria, like plants. Not all meanings are accessible to all agents. Human meanings may or may not be accessible to some animals, for example. And so she has a capacious definition of cognition. So the machine has cognition in the sense of it generate. This is not about whether the machine is conscious or not, but it can generate meaning. That I think is not controversial. And then adapting this theory by Carrie Wolf, jagged ontologies. She talks about conscious, non-conscious cognition in humans and more than human entities. So in this ontological view, humans are not the only the only beings to have cognition. It's interesting, she comes up with the phrase non-conscious cognition. So you don't necessarily have to be conscious, as defined by Western philosophy, to be able to engage in cognitive activities. Some examples she gave, probably easier to follow, is that animals, for example, the behavioral change is interpreted as cognition. Right? Input, output, right? Environmental stimuli changes, animals would adjust behaviors accordingly. And that is a form of cognition. So, and humans, of course, would do similar things. You might say more sophisticated, and we are conscious. But whether you're conscious or not conscious, all of these agents, they're entities with cognition functions. So the cognitive processes are therefore interconnected across biological and computational forms. The only reason why we may not always see it, this is kind of the climate change or the climate change deniers, right? It's ideology, but also the scale is so large that as a small entity, humans may not always perceive or register all of these interconnected things. So that's where this is going. And like the previous one, the goal here is to critique the notion of human supremacy in anthropocentrism, as if all other beings exist to serve human needs, only to serve human needs. And there's the misconception that only humans make decisions. It's called cognitive responsibility. Of course, animals and even plants, they make plenty of decisions. Humans are not the only entity to make decisions. So I think she's pushing the envelope, trying to level the playing ground because of what she says is biases in the metaphors already, that if humans are the only one making decisions, it is horrible. It is wrong for AI that the AI can make decisions and so on. I think decisions here are meant very capaciously. It's not about a ruling in court, when it's about going left or right. As simple as this. So of course, algorithms make plenty, gazillion of decisions in flash, in a matter of less than 1 second. And to say that those are decisions, those are on par, well, not the same quality as human decisions. That's important to recognize, so that it's an ecology, like I said, it's ecology of words, and we are part of this. That does make me feel also powerless sometimes. If it's such a huge environment, so many agents, and a lot of them I can't see or can't even recognize actively all the time, right? I guess that's the point, to kind of counter anthropocentrism. We can come back and talk about whether anthropocentrism necessarily is always problematic. So, of course, this is working toward the eco-critical idea that the idea that humans alone control ecosystems is is a false belief, and that leads to technological crisis. So if we can change our thinking, we can begin to see all of these, not necessarily as partners, but as co-agents, then we can better avert technological crisis.
I found these articles really stimulating. I did find myself questioning whether she wants to use a new language to talk about our relationship to AI. And I felt like she already knew what her goal was, which was that we have to have a positive relationship with it instead of having a fearful relationship with AI, and that she constructs her metaphors in order to achieve that goal. That was one thing that I felt. Then there are a couple other thoughts I had. One thing I thought was really interesting, where she has, I can't remember which of the two pieces, I think it was in the longer one, where she talks about the necessity of understanding that we're operating from within the technosymbiosis data stream. Like, we're not outside it observing what's happening, but we're actually in it. I mean, she doesn't make some grand statement about what that means so much as saying that it's necessary that we understand ourselves to be already enmeshed in that. That was one thing. And then the other point I wanted to talk about was this question of choice that you just talked about in decision making. One thing that she throws out a bone every once in a while to the need to reconsider liberal constitutions of the self, but she doesn't go into like how she's challenging the whole idea of free will, right? Because if everyone's making decisions, including bacteria, then, and that we are as humans not actually that different from every other form of being, including AI, then does free will matter at all? Or does she say none of us have free will and we're just reacting to our environments? I don't know. I just felt like that was an area she was so anxious to make sure that she didn't adopt an anthrocentric position, that she wasn't going to get into that. Yeah. Well, we have to wrap it up, mostly because I have to go to class, but I can leave if someone else wants to return the keys to Max. But thank you so much, Alexa, for leading this discussion. I think it's really interesting.